The Gospel of John doesn't talk about miracles. It talks about signs. How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? Ask the Pharisees. Not cures or healings or tricks or feats, but signs. You might not catch this if you were reading the King James Version, for example, which translates the Greek as miracles in this passage. But the word in question, semeion, is better understood as an indicator, a corroboration of identity, a distinguishing mark. By these signs, we know who Jesus is. Not merely that he is the Messiah, but what kind of Messiah he is, what it means for him to be the Messiah. The Gospel of John contains 7 such signs, and traditionally, you may recognize these. They are water into wine at the wedding of Cana, the healing of a royal official's son in Capernaum, healing the paralyzed man in Bethesda, feeding the 5,000, calming the storm and walking on water, today's restoration of sight to the blind man, and the raising of Lazarus, which we will explore next week. Each one of these signs does more than simply demonstrate Jesus' power. They reveal something particular about who Jesus really is. Now, each of these signs, of course, deserves its own full sermon, and I have a feeling I'll have plenty of time to do so in the coming years. But I'll tell you right now, one overarching theme that is true for all of them, and I encourage you to check me on this, is that in every one of the 7 signs, Jesus invites our participation. In fact, if I may say it a little more boldly, the signs require our participation. It may not be the hallmark of the sign, it may not be the most supernatural element of it, but Jesus always issues an instruction to the people present, usually the beneficiary of the sign, the receiver of healing. In today's scripture, Jesus tells the man to go to the pool of Siloam and wash the spit mud off his eyes. Is that the most incredible step in the process? No, and it's not even the strangest. How important is it? Do you think the man's vision was restored before he washed the mud away or after? When exactly does the healing occur? All the text tells us is that he came back able to see. Now, some have looked at moments like these and concluded with familiar phrasing that God helps those who help themselves. I almost agree, but not quite. I see why one might think that, but to quote the legendary Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride, I do not think it means what you think it means. First of all, in many signs, including this one, our action is last. Jesus does his part first. Jesus doesn't start off by testing the man's obedience, withholding help until he can see if the man is someone worth saving. Jesus does his mysterious and awesome part and then invites the man to complete the sign. This is not a bootstrapping metaphor, nor does it suggest limits on God's power. No, this is telling us something about who Jesus is and how God works. This detail tells us that our God is non-coercive. Jesus doesn't heal people who don't want to be healed, not because he can't, but because he loves us. And when you love someone, you don't deprive them of agency. You don't take away their choice. Our ability to choose is part of being made in God's image. And to take that away by forcing healing upon us, well, that's not who God created us to be, and that's not how God is. And very importantly, especially here in the Gospel of John, that's not how the new creation gets made. The different Gospels, they have different ways of articulating what exactly God is up to with and through Jesus. And for John, the Gospel story is that of a new creation. It's why the book starts all the way back in the beginning. And it shows up in this sign as well, when Jesus spits into the dirt to make the mud. The creation of Adam from the humus, the earth, echoes through this moment. Except instead of God's breath bringing the first human to life, this time it is water. Still from his mouth, but it's spit, saliva, water that comes from his body. And weren't we just talking about living water last week? This man who had been blind from birth, he comes back from the pool a new man, newly created, so new, in fact, his neighbors don't even recognize him. Is this not the man who used to sit and beg? No, but it is someone like him, they say. He is part of the new creation, and incredibly, was invited to take part in his own transformation. It wasn't simply bestowed, it was co-created. This is by design. I've said that these aren't obedience or loyalty tests, but there is something about the nature of Jesus' instructions that reveals something in us. The task of washing in a pool is not terribly complicated or demanding. It's not an enormous or impossible feat. Jesus asks the man to do something he knows he can do. And most of the work here belongs to God. But the strangeness of the ask, the ways in which the whole thing is counterintuitive, is intentional and indicative of who Jesus is. The strangeness is part of the sign. When the blind man stands up and goes to the pool, he is showing to Jesus a certain willingness to relinquish expectation, to abandon a certain kind of logic, both physical and theological. Don't forget that this whole story begins with the disciples believing that they know how sin works. Jesus meets a lot of people who think they know how things work. And part of Jesus' big point here, an ongoing feature of his curriculum of signs, is, well, things don't have to work that way. This blindness, I do not think it means what you think it means. So he asks people to do something weird, something bizarre, something out of the ordinary, but ultimately accomplishable. We can call it a leap of faith, but perhaps it's more accurate to call it a stretch of the imagination. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it like a warm-up stretch. In order to participate in this new creation, first we're going to have to get limber and set aside our ideas of how things work. Throughout our Lenten journey this year, we've been asking a series of questions around Jesus' invitation to the disciples, "Follow me." We want to say yes, but it's not always clear what yes means. When? How? Who? Me? Today, we're looking at what to follow. And I'll give you the short answer right here and now. Follow Jesus' instructions, his teachings, his commandments. That's our compass. Well, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Question answered, sermon done, lesson learned, right? Well, maybe. Like most things, that's something easier said than done. And if you, too, have ever had to dig a frozen pizza box out of the trash for the second time just to triple check you read that oven temperature correctly, then you know that it's often the simplest instructions that our human minds have the hardest time grasping. Straightforward as this direction here may sound, look around at Christianity in America today. Do you think we're all on the same page about this? Do we all agree that the job, the calling of a Christian is to follow Jesus' instructions and ways? I certainly thought I'd never see the day that I missed those stretchy little WWJD bracelets. But lately, I have heard some of the things coming out of the mouths of our leaders and the sycophants that surround them and have wanted to rend my garments and shout to the heavens, "Why is nobody asking, what would Jesus do?" Did they give up on the question? The truth is, one of the greatest temptations embedded within our religion, one that has accompanied us since the very beginning, is to try to do more than Jesus asks. It always feels noble, faithful. It often feels brave or courageous. But it is a more that always ends up being a less. It causes harm. We inherit ancient Hebrew scriptures that offer us glimpses of heaven, that record the history of our faith and our spiritual ancestors. And yet, too often, our own brethren have mined them to support their prejudice and violence. We weave together all these glimpses and start to think it's our job to force, to coerce this vision into existence. We try to take something off of God's plate and put it on ours. The same is true of the epistles, the letters from Paul and his followers, of Revelation to John. Whenever one of our fellow Christians wants to justify ICE violence or airstriking innocent civilians or separating families at the border or dehumanizing and erasing trans people, they'll pull from all over the Bible. Oh, this little line from Deuteronomy, this little bit from Romans. But guess what? It's almost never from the Gospels. And it is never from Jesus' instructions. None of that is meant to undermine the tremendous gift that we have in Scripture. These words are holy. Even the parts we wrestle with, disagree with, argue with, the wrestling, the disagreeing, and the arguing brings us closer to God. And that's how we know it's holy. But not every word of Scripture is prescriptive. We can't flatten it out into a univocal document, a letter written by God addressed to us. Not every word in the Bible is Jesus' instructions. And at the end of the day, we're not Biblists. We're Christians. And that means we follow Christ, the way. Don't forget that he had these scriptures too. He knew what he was talking about, and he knew what he was doing in giving us specific instructions. Remember, Jesus is our teacher. As we draw closer to Easter in these coming days, I invite you to stay in this place of wonder and readiness, listening for instructions as if you yourself were that blind man, so ready for change, for a way for change to be taught and revealed. Listen closely for Jesus' words here in Scripture and in your hearts. Consider what ideas you have about how things work. And consider which ones of those might actually be limiting your imagination about how things could be. Remember that our God is non-coercive and by requirement. Therefore, our path forward must be so too. Remember that though we might glimpse the shape of the new creation, our responsibility in birthing it is a humble peace, and that the vast majority of the work lies in God's hands. And yet, remember that humble peace is nonetheless crucial. It is needed. It is important. Trust Jesus that it is enough, and may all eyes be opened, each of us made new.